Between 1975 and 1995, 10 different voices stepped into a recording studio for the first time. Laid down something so powerful it stopped the entire world cold. And then the world moved on before any of them got the second chapter they deserved.
A quick hit. That's your game.
These weren't just songs. They were final statements, accidental testaments, and in some cases, the last complete thing an artist gave to the world before illness, violence, addiction, or a grief too deep to carry took them before they ever got the chance to be heard again. Today on Rhythm Origins, we are counting down 10 R&B artists who gave the world their signature song and then left us. And we are saving number 1 for the singer who whispered her own baby daughter's name at the end of a love song. Recorded while battling a cancer diagnosis she was told would kill her in 6 months. And whose tombstone today carries the exact opening line of the song that made her immortal. Number 10. Trapped, Colonel Abrams, 1985. Colonel Abrams was a New York City-born singer and dancer who spent most of the early 80s building a reputation as one of the most electrifying live performers on the city's underground dance circuit. A gifted vocalist with an enormous voice and a stage presence that turned heads in a competitive New York scene, but who consistently struggled to convert that local notoriety into the kind of mainstream commercial breakthrough that should have followed naturally from the quality of what he was doing on stage every night. When Trapped was released in 1985 on MCA Records, the track was a synth-driven, emotionally raw R&B and dance cut built around a single theme of being emotionally caught between staying and leaving, and it built a slow, steady international following through club play in the UK long before American radio gave it meaningful attention, eventually reaching number 3 in the UK singles chart and earning Abrams a level of European recognition that outpaced anything he had achieved in his own country. The American music industry, chasing the polished new jack swing sound that was about to dominate the second half of the decade, largely failed to position Trapped for the mainstream US pop crossover that the song's quality and Abrams' vocal performance clearly warranted. And he spent the years following its release cycling through labels and projects without ever finding the second hit that would have given him the career foundation the first one had promised. Colonel Abrams died on December 24, 2016, at the age of 67, and the details of his final years that emerged after his passing were the kind of story that the music industry prefers to leave in the dark. Because those who knew him described a man who had been living in genuinely difficult conditions, having been largely forgotten by an industry that had moved on without compensating him fairly for the work he did, and whose death fell on Christmas Eve without the memorial coverage that any other artist with a UK top 3 single and a still growing cult following would have received. The irony embedded in a song literally called Trapped, belonging to an artist who spent his final decades unable to escape the commercial failure of the industry's neglect, is one of the more uncomfortable truths in the entire history of 1980s dance R&B. And Trapped remains one of the decade's most underplayed gems, carrying a weight in its lyrics that the man who sang it knew something about personally. Number 9. We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, Jermaine Stewart, 1986. Jermaine Stewart arrived at his debut solo recording in 1986 as a background vocalist and dancer who had toured with Culture Club and worked as a session contributor for multiple artists, bringing genuine stage experience but virtually no mainstream name recognition in the United States, to the recording of the song that would define his entire public legacy. We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off, a pop soul track with a deliberately anti-hedonism message. At the height of an era when Madonna was selling sexuality to the mainstream, and the club scene was defined by its increasingly explicit energy, became a top 5 hit on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching number 5 in the US and number 2 in the UK, where it received even heavier airplay rotation than it did at home. The song's central premise, that intimacy and connection didn't require physical escalation, was unusual enough in its era that the chart success was genuinely surprising to some in the industry. And its upbeat arrangement and Stewart's smooth, accessible vocal delivery gave it a radio friendliness that kept it in heavy rotation long after its initial release window, making it one of the most identifiable R&B pop singles of the mid-'80s, despite its relatively short promotional campaign. Stewart's own private life, he was gay. In an era when being openly gay in the R&B industry was not merely socially discouraged, but professionally terminal, gave the song's lyric about emotional boundaries a personal dimension that most listeners at the time did not know they were hearing. Jermaine Stewart was diagnosed with HIV and, as the disease progressed through the late 80s and early 90s, found himself largely sidelined by an industry that had moved on to younger acts, and that was navigating its own painful collective reckoning with how to publicly acknowledge the AIDS crisis within its ranks. He died on March 17, 1997, at the age of 39, of AIDS-related complications, and the near silence with which his death was met by the mainstream music industry. Despite the fact that the song he was best known for had told that same industry nearly a decade earlier that human beings deserve to be treated with dignity and restraint, remains one of the more quietly devastating ironies in the documented history of the era. His vocal performance on We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off is searchable and fully available today. And it sounds nothing like the work of a man. Anyone should have forgotten this completely. Number 8. What You Won't Do for Love, Bobby Caldwell, 1978. Bobby Caldwell's label TK Records made a calculated, deliberate decision in 1978 not to put his photograph on the sleeve of What You Won't Do for Love. Not in the album artwork, not in promotional materials sent to radio stations, and not in any visual press campaign, because Bobby Caldwell was white. His voice sounded almost entirely black. And the label's internal research showed that if black radio stations knew the vocalist behind this silky, soulful R&B ballad was a young white man from Miami, the song would never receive the airplay that its quality deserved. The gamble worked. What You Won't Do for Love hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 6 on the R&B chart, driven almost entirely by black radio stations who had no idea they were championing a white artist. And Bobby Caldwell became the only white vocalist to appear on the Soul Train television program in 1978. A booking that reportedly generated a visible, documented moment of surprise from the live studio audience. when he walked out to perform a song they had been hearing on the radio for weeks, assuming the voice belonged to someone who looked very different. Caldwell's voice was genuinely extraordinary, a tenor with a natural soul cadence and an emotional instinct for phrasing that rivaled any of the black artists charting around him that year. And the commercial success of What You Won't Do for Love was not built on deception so much as it was built on the industry's own racism being used against it. A moment where the music was allowed to be heard before the face was allowed to create a barrier. Bobby Caldwell spent the decades following What You Won't Do for Love as a cult figure in the adult contemporary and smooth jazz world, releasing albums that earned devoted followings without ever replicating the mainstream chart impact of his debut single. And the song itself became one of the most sampled recordings in the history of hip-hop, with artists from Tupac to Kanye West to Michael Bublé drawing from its arrangement and its deeply embedded emotional core. He died on March 15, 2023, at the age of 71. Not from illness in the conventional sense, but from complications arising from accidental sodium bromate poisoning. A toxic substance he had unknowingly ingested through a mispackaged supplement over an extended period, making his death one of the most bizarre and avoidable endings in the documented history of the R&B era. The irony that a man who spent his career fighting to be heard past the visual barrier of his own face died from something invisible that nobody saw coming until it was too late is the kind of tragic symmetry that sounds too perfect to be real. And yet every detail of it is verified, documented, and absolutely true. Number 7. Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now, McFadden and Whitehead, 1979. Gene McFadden and John Whitehead were Philadelphia soul veterans who had spent years writing and producing for other people. Their songwriting credits included work for Teddy Pendergrass, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and multiple Philadelphia International Records artists. Before Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff finally agreed to let them step in front of the microphone themselves and record Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now in 1979. The song became a #1 R&B hit, crossed over to the top 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, and arrived at precisely the moment that disco was beginning its commercial collapse. And the American public was looking for something with the soul and groove of the best funk records, but the optimism of a civil rights era anthem and Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now delivered all of that in 3 minutes and 49 seconds. Built on a lyric that McFadden and Whitehead wrote specifically as a celebration of black perseverance and forward momentum after watching the previous generation's political gains being slowly eroded. The song became an anthem that has been used at sporting events, political campaigns, and graduation ceremonies for over 4 decades without losing a single ounce of its original uplift. And for a duo who had spent years making other people famous, the commercial breakthrough was the validation of a songwriting partnership that had been building toward exactly this moment since the late 1960s. John Whitehead was shot and killed on May 11, 2004, in a drive-by shooting in Philadelphia while doing yard work outside his own home on a Tuesday afternoon. A senseless act of violence that took a man who had spent his career writing songs about perseverance and survival in the exact city whose streets eventually ended his life at age 64. Gene McFadden, who had watched his partner be buried before him, died on January 27, 2006, of cancer. meaning that within 2 years, the duo who had told the world that nothing could stop them were both gone, taken by two of the most brutal and indiscriminate forces that routinely end lives in American communities. Gun violence and untreated illness, neither of which gave any consideration to the voice that had built one of the most enduring anthems of optimism in the entire R&B catalog. Ain't No Stoppin' Us Now is still played at stadiums and rallies around the world today, which is either a tribute to how powerful the song is, or a painful reminder of how little the world it described has actually changed. Number 6. Down Home Blues, ZZ Hill, 1982. When Malaco Records released Down Home Blues by ZZ Hill in 1982, most of the national R&B and pop industry was chasing electronic production, synthesizer-heavy funk, and the new jack sound that was starting to reshape the commercial landscape, and the idea that a stripped-down, guitar-driven blues soul record with a raw, unhurried vocal performance from a veteran artist who had been recording since the 1960s without a major mainstream breakthrough was going to cut through any of that noise was not a prediction that most people in the industry would have made with confidence. ZZ Hill, born Arzell Hill in Naples, Texas, in 1935, had spent nearly 2 decades as a regional touring artist with a reputation that far exceeded his record sales, and Down Home Blues was his attempt. And Malaco's bet that there was still an audience for honest, unadorned R&B blues that spoke directly to a Southern black audience the mainstream industry had largely stopped trying to reach. The song connected with that audience in a way that surprised even the people who believed in it, building through word of mouth and regional radio into a commercial phenomenon that placed Down Home Blues at the top of the R&B chart for an extended run that was completely out of proportion to the promotional budget behind it, and revitalized not just ZZ Hill's career, but the entire Southern soul and blues market that Malaco Records would continue to serve for the next 3 decades. ZZ Hill was recording new music and touring to support the continuing success of Down Home Blues when he was hospitalized after a blood clot formed following a car accident, and he died on April 27, 1984. At the age of 49, before he could fully understand or experience the commercial legacy that his most celebrated song was still building around him, because the record continued charting and selling even after his death, eventually becoming the reference point for an entire renaissance of Southern soul that his breakthrough had made commercially viable. He never lived to see himself named as the godfather of the contemporary blues revival, never saw the Malaco sound that his record essentially launched become one of the most important niches in American music, and never heard the dozens of artists who cited Down Home Blues as the specific record that proved real, unpolished R&B could still find an audience in the middle of the most synthetic decade in pop music history. But every one of those things happened because of him, and every one of them is verifiable. Number 5. Walk Away from Love, David Ruffin, 1975. David Ruffin had already sung lead on some of the most celebrated records in Motown history, My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, and I Wish It Would Rain among them, as the signature voice of the Temptations, before his increasingly erratic behavior, drug use, and demands for individual billing forced the group and Berry Gordy to let him go in 1968, at which point the music industry broadly assumed that a man who had just been fired from one of the most successful vocal groups in American music history for being impossible to work with had probably ended his own commercial relevance before it could fully begin. His 1975 comeback single Walk Away From Love, produced by Van McCoy, was the definitive answer to 7 years of inconsistent output and personal chaos.
That even I don't understand.
A sweeping, orchestrated soul ballad that gave Ruffin's enormous, raspy, emotionally precise tenor exactly the kind of showcase material that the post-Motown commercial market rewarded, and it reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart, proving that the voice that had made My Girl a standard was still fully operational even if the man behind it was not. For a brief period in 1975 and 1976, David Ruffin looked like an artist in the middle of a second chapter that might outshine the first, and Walk Away From Love was the record that made that possibility feel genuinely real to people who had written him off 6 years earlier. The second chapter never arrived in the way Walk Away From Love had promised, because the cocaine addiction that had shadowed Ruffin's career since the late 1960s deepened through the 1980s into a dependence that his earnings, his relationships, and eventually his body were unable to sustain.
Every time you touch my hand.
And on June 1, 1991, David Ruffin was found unconscious inside a limousine that had been driven to the emergency room of the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania by persons who could not be identified, after having been in a crack house on Broad Street in Philadelphia. He died that same day of a cocaine overdose at the age of 50, and the manner of his death, the anonymous limousine, the unidentified individuals, the crack house on a public city street, told a story about the distance between the soaring vocal performances of My Girl and Walk Away From Love, and the reality of the life that produced them, that no music industry biography has ever fully reconciled. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Temptations in 1989, 2 years before his death, so the recognition came while he was still alive to receive it, which is more than several others on this countdown can claim. Number 4, You Know How to Love Me, Phyllis Hyman, 1979. Arrived in New York City in the mid-70s as a Pittsburgh-born singer with a 6-foot frame, voice of staggering range and power, and a presence so commanding that the jazz and soul venues where she was building her name early in her career were reportedly arguing among themselves about who had discovered her. And when Arista Records signed her, and Clive Davis paired her with James Mtume and Reggie Lucas to produce You Know How to Love Me in 1979, the resulting recording was the kind of career-launching single that most artists spend a decade trying to create. The song reached the top 15 on the R&B chart, established Hyman as a formidable presence in the adult contemporary soul market, and opened doors to Broadway, where she was Tony Award nominated for Best Featured Actress in a Musical for her role in Sophisticated Ladies, the Duke Ellington tribute that ran from 1981 to 1983, making her simultaneously one of the most impressive vocal talents in R&B and one of the most respected new presences in the theatrical world. A crossover that should have positioned her for the kind of mainstream commercial dominance her talent clearly warranted. Instead, what followed was a career defined by frustration of records that earned critical respect without the crossover radio support she deserved, a deteriorating relationship with Clive Davis over creative direction, battle with bipolar disorder, depression, alcohol, and cocaine that the music industry was not equipped, or willing, to address as anything other than a liability. Noon of June 30th, 1995, hours before she was scheduled to headline a performance at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, Phyllis Hyman was found unconscious in the bedroom of her New York City apartment at 211 West 56th Street, having overdosed on pentobarbital and secobarbital. And the note she left behind, the full text of which has been documented in multiple verified sources and biographies, read simply, "I'm tired. I'm tired. Those of you that I love know who you are. May God bless you." She died 3 hours later at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, 6 days before what would have been her 46th birthday. And the show at the Apollo went on without her, while the people who loved her were still trying to process what had happened. The music industry's response to her death has been described by her surviving collaborators and fans as criminally inadequate, omitted from multiple televised memorial segments that same year, honoring artists lost in 1995, and You Know How to Love Me remains one of the most powerful vocal performances in the history of late 70s R&B, delivered by a woman who deserved every stage she ever stood on, and then some. Number 3. You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real. Sylvester, 1978. Sylvester James grew up in Los Angeles, started singing in Pentecostal church choirs as a child, was asked to leave the church, and eventually his mother's home, because the congregation did not welcome his openly gay identity, moved to San Francisco as a teenager, and spent years performing in the clubs of the Castro district before Fantasy Records gave him the opportunity to record You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real. In 1978, a song that hit the top of Billboard's dance chart and entered mainstream pop culture as one of the defining anthems of the disco era. While Sylvester performed it in full makeup, flamboyant costume, and the kind of unapologetic gender-bending presentation that no black male artist at his commercial level had ever maintained so publicly and so completely in American music. The song was released just 1 month before Harvey Milk, the San Francisco city supervisor and gay rights pioneer who was Sylvester's friend and had attended his performances, was assassinated at City Hall. And in the immediate aftermath of Milk's murder, the song became something beyond a dance hit, transforming in real time into a rallying point for gay San Franciscans who were grieving a political ally and needed something that felt like defiant survival. Something that said loudly and in public that they were still here and they were still real, which is exactly what Sylvester had been saying with every performance for years before the tragedy gave the lyric its new weight. Fantasy Records, watching their artist achieve commercial success on a scale they hadn't projected, responded in 1979 by telling Sylvester they wanted to tone down his image, suggesting he present himself more like Teddy Pendergrass, the smooth, conventionally masculine soul star, and Sylvester reportedly listened politely, shot one video in a suit to satisfy them, and then went directly back to being himself on every stage and in every interview for the remainder of his life. Sylvester was never tested for HIV because, as he told friends in the mid-1980s, he already knew he had the virus and saw no point in a diagnosis confirming what his body was making clear. And in 1987, his husband died of AIDS-related complications, which meant Sylvester spent the last year of his own life grieving, while his own health declined at the same rate the grief arrived. In 1988, months before his death, he appeared in the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day Parade, visibly ill and visibly present, and friends who were with him recalled that even in the final months, he kept his humor intact, reportedly telling his backup singer Jeannie Tracy that he wanted to be buried in a pearl-colored casket because he refused to look like he was lying in a white refrigerator. Sylvester died on December 16, 1988, at the age of 41, of AIDS-related complications. And in his will, he left his future royalties to 2 San Francisco AIDS charities, meaning the money generated by You Make Me Feel, Mighty Real, has continued to fund AIDS relief work for decades after his death, making his signature song one of the most quietly generous ongoing legacies in the history of R&B. Number 2. The Closer I Get to You, Donny Hathaway, 1978. Donny Hathaway arrived at Howard University in Washington, D.C. on a scholarship to study music theory. Met Roberta Flack in the same music program, and was producing, arranging, and playing sessions for other artists before he was 20 years old. A prodigy, with a gift so evident that Atlantic Records signed him in 1969, and Rolling Stone magazine declared him a major new force in soul music after his very first single, which should have been the beginning of a commercial trajectory that matched the extraordinary breadth of what he was capable of doing in a recording studio. Instead, Hathaway's career was interrupted repeatedly through the early and mid-70s by a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia that brought hospitalizations, creative standstills, and a breakdown in his relationship with Roberta Flack serious enough that the two did not record together for several years after their first collaborative success. And the medication regimen required to manage his condition, documented by people close to him as being as many as 14 pills taken 2 to 3 times daily, produced side effects that made his personal and professional life a constant negotiation between stability and the kind of creative openness that his art required. The reconciliation that produced The Closer I Get to You in 1978 was therefore not just a musical reunion between two former Howard University classmates. It was a documented act of faith by Flack in a man that the industry and his illness had both been working against, and the song's peak at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, its Grammy nomination for Best Pop Performance, and the genuine warmth of the recorded vocal performance between them suggested that everything the illness had interrupted was still intact and still waiting. On January 13, 1979, Donny Hathaway was in a New York City recording studio working on the follow-up album to the session that had produced his Grammy-nominated comeback. And witnesses in the studio that day, including arranger James Mintume, documented that Hathaway became progressively agitated and delusional during the session, eventually telling Mintume that he heard voices, that there were white people trying to steal his music, and that he needed to leave the studio immediately. The session ended early, and hours later Hathaway's body was found on the sidewalk below his 15th floor room at the Essex House Hotel in New York City. With investigators noting that the safety glass from the window had been carefully removed and placed on the bed inside the room before he fell, a detail that his family and many who knew him have never been able to fully reconcile with a simple ruling of suicide. Not because they denied his illness, but because the deliberateness required to remove window glass stood in uncomfortable contrast to the delusional agitation witnesses had described just hours earlier in the studio. And because people close to him noted that leaning out of open windows while singing into the night was a habit Hathaway was known for, something he had done in hotels across the country to the documented frustration of hotel managers who objected to the noise. He was 33 years old, in the middle of a Grammy-nominated comeback, and every musician who has spoken about Donny Hathaway in the 46 years since his death has said some version of the same thing, that they do not know what they would have received from him if he had lived, but that what he left behind is enough to understand exactly what was lost. Number 1. Lovin' You, Minnie Riperton, 1975. Minnie Riperton had a 5-octave vocal range, an instrument so extraordinary that Stevie Wonder, who had been training and producing among the most gifted voices in the industry for over a decade by the early 70s, personally recruited her as a member of his touring backing group, Wonderlove, and then co-produced her album Perfect Angel in 1974 because he believed her voice was unlike anything he had encountered, and Lovin' You, the song that would become her defining legacy, was not written as a commercial single, was not built for radio, and was not produced with any explicit ambition beyond the most private imaginable. It was a lullaby, composed by Minnie and her husband Richard Rudolph for their baby daughter Maya, and in the unedited version of the recording, Minnie can be heard softly repeating her daughter's name near the end of the track. A personal moment of maternal tenderness, embedded inside what became a #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 on April 5, 1975, heard by millions of people who had no idea that the sound most of them assumed was pure vocal improvisation, was actually a mother calling her daughter's name over a song she had written to help her child sleep at night. The song's distinctive high falsetto flourishes, which became the most imitated and referenced element of the recording in the decades that followed, were not a performance choice so much as they were Minnie simply singing the way she always sang, at the absolute ceiling of her natural range, in a register that most trained vocalists cannot reach without years of specialized technical practice, executed on that recording with the casual grace of someone who had lived at that altitude their entire life. In January 1976, 9 months after Lovin' You had reached #1, Minnie Riperton was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer, and because the cancer had already metastasized by the time it was detected, her doctors gave her approximately 6 months to live, a timeline she exceeded by over 3 years, through a combination of treatment, public advocacy, and a determination to perform and record for as long as her body allowed her to do so. She became one of the first celebrities in American history to go public with a breast cancer diagnosis, appearing on The Tonight Show in August 1976 to speak openly about her illness, at a time when cancer was still largely discussed in private and with the kind of fearful silence that her candor directly challenged. And in 1978, President Jimmy Carter presented her with the American Cancer Society's Courage Award at the White House, an honor she received while continuing to tour and record, continuing to perform Lovin' You in concert, and in her final performances adding the name of her son Mark, who went by the nickname Ringo, so that the song she had written for both her children could hold both of them at once, singing Maya, Maya, Ringo, Maya, at the part of the arrangement where most audiences expected only the now familiar wordless falsetto. Minnie Riperton died on July 12, 1979, at the age of 31, 2 weeks before her daughter Maya's 7th birthday, and the epitaph carved into her headstone at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Los Angeles is the opening line of the song she wrote for her baby, the same line that has opened millions of mornings and late nights and quiet moments of grief for people who may not have known her name when they first heard it, but have never forgotten her voice. Lovin' You is easy, 'cause you're beautiful.